Hello and welcome back to Ye Olde Guide, a podcast about the history and heritage of the towns and cities of England. Now, if you're listening from a brick house in England, there is a reasonable chance that your house is built with Fletton bricks. And these bricks were manufactured in massive quantities at sites where the Oxford clay layer, rich in organic compounds, reaches the surface. And these Fletton bricks are named after the vast brickworks that existed for much of the 20th century at Fletton, just south of Peterborough city centre. And it's Peterborough we are visiting for this episode. But there's a lot more to Peterborough than a pile of bricks, I can assure you. And at this point, I will welcome you to our podcast. I'm Liam McGrath, and I'm delighted to introduce the historian layering up the brickwork of urban history, Daniel Gooch. So, apart from bricks, what is the highlight of Peterborough for you?
I think the highlight for most people, the thing most people will know it for, would be the cathedral. It's been there for a very long time. We'll definitely go into the detail of that today. A big highlight for me, though, is a more abstract thing. Just the Peterborough Chronicle, one of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, one of the most important ones. The latest one started. That's a really important document in English history, so you can imagine I loved reading about that. But yeah, both things we're going to cover in quite a lot of detail today.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to talking about the cathedral. You're absolutely right. It's brilliant. And yeah, wow, the Chronicle. I knew nothing about this, so looking forward to talking about that. Our podcast is split into 5 sections covering politics and war, science and industry, arts and culture, and urban layout, plus a general review of how the city compared with our expectations. And we'll be giving a score in each of these 5 categories just for fun. And the score is for historical interest. You can challenge our scores or comment on anything in the podcast by visiting our website, yeoldeguide.com. So, Daniel, before we get into the categories, let's start with a brief overview of Peterborough's history.
For Peterborough's location, we'll talk about that first, for people who aren't aware. It's about 80 miles north of London in Cambridgeshire, on really the cusp of the east of England towards East Anglia and the south area of the Midlands. It's quite small in city terms, but it's still the largest settlement in Cambridgeshire and one of the largest in eastern England, with a population of about 200,000. Going back to Peterborough's origins, there were some Bronze Age, some Iron Age settlements in the area. Notable examples have been found at Flag Fen to the east of the city. But the first community that came close to being really a recognisable town was the Roman settlement of De Robrevi, which grew from a fort built in the 1st century AD in modern Peterborough's western outskirts. Other Roman buildings have been found in the area, including at Ferry Meadows and on the site of Peterborough Cathedral. But for the first community with a definite continuous link with modern-day Peterborough, this was really the Anglian village, as in Anglo-Saxon, of Mead Hampstead, which grew around an abbey founded around 655 by the first abbot, whose name, beloved of schoolboys everywhere, was Sexwulf.
I mean, it's a funny name, to be fair.
It is. We'll get that out there now. We won't giggle anymore. This abbey and its successors became pivotal to the town, became known as Peterborough. This original abbey was burned to the ground by Vikings in 870 AD. It was refounded later, but not for 100 years. When a new abbey was built in 972, this was the point when, yes, it was refounded kind of in the grounds on the lines you'd expect today. The rebuilt abbey was surrounded by fortifications, meaning Peterborough became a burh, in Anglo-Saxon terms, a fortified town, and a village grew around it. The abbey controlled commercial matters in the city as well. It organised trade fairs and it applied taxes to trade that occurred in and passed through the town. Later, Peterborough's town walls were built in 1000 AD and it became to be known as St. Peter's Burh. The city was destroyed for a second time in the early Middle Ages when a fire in 1116 destroyed the town and the church. The abbey was rebuilt following this fire, and the abbey became a cathedral in 1541 after the dissolution of the monasteries. But today's Peterborough Cathedral, it's recognisably the same building that was constructed in the 12th century, and it's notable as one of the best preserved cathedrals from that era in the country. Although Peterborough was now a city after it gained a cathedral, it remained small with a population of around 1,500. Daniel Defoe described it in the 1720s as a little city, and indeed 'tis the least in England. But he did concede Peterborough is no contemptible place neither. There are some good houses in it and the streets are well built. The diarist John Byng wasn't quite so complimentary in the 1780s on his visit. He said, "Nothing can be worse built than Peterborough, or more melancholy." Though to have some balance, I think he did have a reputation for being a bit overly critical of the places he visited. Later on, Peterborough really started to expand into the city we know today after the Industrial Revolution. It expanded due to new industries such as iron foundries, as you've mentioned, brickmaking from the 19th century, and later as a major railway centre. And Peterborough's expansion continued into recent times when it was made a new town in 1967 as part of the post-war expansion of towns ringing London to take on overspill population from the capital. And the aim at this point was to double Peterborough's population from 80,000 as it was then, and Peterborough's current population sits at around that level, approaching 200,000. So in the long term, mission accomplished.
Yeah, it's grown enormously. So I think that overview, Daniel, really gets to the heart of the layout of Peterborough. You've got this really old historic core, beautiful cathedral. You've then got this clearly expanded railway town around that, and then you've got these vast suburbs, which are the expanded town, the new town that you spoke about. And that's really what you need to understand about the layout. Really old core, but the Peterborough that perhaps a lot of people think of these days is the sprawling Peterborough of suburbs, distribution centres, quite a modern city, but this is this historic core which is probably of most interest to the podcast.
Yeah, one writer described it in just 4 words: ancient city, new town, and all bundled together, and I think that's exactly right. That is how you would characterise the feel of Peterborough.
Let's go into our first category, which is politics and war. And let's start with some famous royal connections.
Yes, let's do that. 3 important women in British history, royal women: 1 Queen of Scotland and France, 1 Queen of England, and 1 wife and mother of a head of state, have been buried in or near Peterborough. We'll start with Catherine of Aragon, wife of Henry VIII. She was buried in Peterborough Cathedral in 1536. This is why Peterborough is twinned with Catherine's birthplace in Spain. Apologies, Spanish listeners, for my pronunciation. Alcalá de Henares, I think is right. Catherine was buried here because she died at nearby Kimbolton. Henry, for reasons which I suppose you can see, didn't want her buried in London, so she was entombed at the nearest grand monastic house, which was Peterborough Cathedral. Her tomb does remain there today. It has a portrait of her above it and a memorial slab from the 1890s. There was a small Tudor festival held in Peterborough in her honour a couple of years ago. There were tours and costumed events at the cathedral, so it is definitely something people come to see.
Well, that's a big historic figure that everyone's heard of.
It is, and I'll give you another one that everyone's heard of: Mary, Queen of Scots.
Well,
she's not there anymore, but she was buried originally in Peterborough Cathedral, this time for a slightly grislier reason, because she was executed, was beheaded at nearby Fotheringhay Castle. As well as being probably Scotland's most famous monarch, she had also, this is sometimes forgotten, been Queen Consort of France as the wife of Francis II, and had asked to be buried in France where she was brought up, but Elizabeth I, who ordered her execution, refused this request. Mary, as I said, is no longer buried at the cathedral. Her body was moved to Westminster Abbey in 1612 on request from her son, who had by then become King James I of England, having previously been James VI of Scotland. But the letter from him requesting the body be moved is now on display in the cathedral. The original tomb, unfortunately, isn't there. It was destroyed in 1643 in the Civil War. Before I move on to the final figure, I'll just mention quite an important local figure, Old Scarlet. That's a name to anyone that will be familiar to anyone with an interest in Peterborough's history, because Mary and Catherine are reputed to have been buried by the same local gravedigger, Robert Scarlet, known as Old Scarlet. He lived till the age of 98. He's a bit of a local legend in Peterborough. It's been suggested he might have inspired the gravediggers in Hamlet, one of the ones who digs up Yorick's skull. You know, the line, "Alas, poor Yorick." I don't think that's definitively known. It's more speculation. Old Scarlet was also buried in the cathedral, and you can also see a painting of him. The cathedral shop's been named Old Scarlet's Emporium. There's a drawing of him albeit an 18th century copy in the National Portrait Gallery. So he's definitely a figure with good connections to Peterborough.
That's absolutely brilliant. Fantastic fact. Who else is there anyone else connected?
The final one was not really a royal connection, it's almost an anti-royal connection. Elizabeth Cromwell is buried in St Andrew's Church in Northborough, near Peterborough. Elizabeth was wife of England's first ever non-royal head of state, Oliver Cromwell, and also sometimes forgotten mother of the last, their son Richard, who briefly took over as head of state as protector after Oliver died before the restoration of the monarchy. Oliver was from nearby. He was born in Huntingdon. The east of England was a parliamentarian stronghold during the Civil War. And Elizabeth had been living in her son-in-law's house in Northborough when she died, which I think is how she ended up being buried in the church there.
So you mentioned the Civil War a couple of times, and you mentioned the impact it had on the cathedral in the start. But let's just talk a bit about some of the other battles that Peterborough's seen, being an old historic city.
Yeah, there's been a bit of military action there. We'll start off with 870. We mentioned this briefly earlier, but this is when the abbey was burned to the ground by the Vikings. It was only refounded 100 years later, quite a gap in between. But it was still an important moment for Peterborough because the rebuilt abbey was surrounded by fortifications, which was the point at which Peterborough became this fortified town. And this is where the current name of the city came from, Peterborough, also including the name of the saint that the abbey was then dedicated to. Moving on a bit, the Barons' War, which we talked about, I think we talked a lot about that in our Lincoln episode.
Lincoln, I think.
Yeah, it was. During this, King John, it was basically a kind of a battle for power between King John and some of the powerful noblemen in the country. He stayed in Peterborough during the Barons' War. This was a conflict that ultimately led to the reinstatement of Magna Carta. He used it as a bit of an operational base as well. Moving on from there, Wars of the Roses. There was a bit of action there. The cathedral in the town was sacked by Margaret of Anjou. She was wife of Henry VI. She was effectively commander of the Lancastrian forces. This happened really because nearby Fotheringhay Castle was seat of the House of York, hence its importance in the war. The Civil War is the next thing we'll talk about. Peterborough, particularly the cathedral, was ransacked by parliamentarian forces during the Civil War. It was, as we mentioned, on the periphery of the parliamentarian stronghold of East Anglia, so really in the midst of raids on royalist towns nearby, like ones in Lincolnshire. There was a 2016 archaeological dig in the Dean's Garden of the Abbey, and it found artefacts from the parliamentarian army. It found beer bottles, clay pipes and musket balls. They're still digging these things up today. After the war, Charles I was held prisoner in Peterborough in 1646 in the Abbot's Jail next to the cathedral. He was held there on his way to London before his imprisonment and execution there. And the door of that jail is currently in Peterborough Museum. So you can see that little artefact there.
Oh, wow.
And then final mention in this category, the Napoleonic Wars. You probably wouldn't expect Peterborough to have that much of a link with wars fought on the continent and at sea. But there is quite an interesting one, because the world's first purpose-built prisoner of war camp was constructed near Peterborough from 1797 to 1816. And during the Napoleonic Wars, several thousand French prisoners of war were held in camps at this area nearby Norman Cross. Population estimates seem to vary, but it was certainly vastly more, the population of the prisoner of war camp, than the population of Peterborough at the time. The camp was built here because it was near London, accessible by river and hard to escape from. So ticked the big three boxes there.
There's a wide array of historical periods mentioned there. And I think that's quite interesting, because you wouldn't necessarily think that visiting Peterborough. You've mentioned the museum, and of course the cathedral's still there. But a lot of this you don't really get much of a sense of in the reputation of Peterborough, or even in visiting. What are your thoughts?
I suppose that's right. I mean, for a city with such a long history, it would be astonishing if there was nothing that had happened there. I suppose there's nothing particularly significant in its own right, really. If we're summing up and doing the scores, there's a bit here, a bit there, but there's nothing that stands out as being a major battle, a major political event that's happened in or concerning Peterborough. I mean, if you think about some of the other places we've visited, Reading had, although it was small, a hugely significant and consequential battle, if you want to call it that, more of a skirmish. Other places we talked about, Wakefield, had hugely important battles in the Wars of the Roses. So yeah, there's quite a lot that's interesting there. There are some nice remnants. It can't be a particularly high score though. So If we're doing scores now, I think it's going to be probably a 2.5 from me.
2.5. Oh, first score of the podcast episode, and it's quite a low one. I'm gonna go for a 3, mainly because I was surprised by what you did find, and given its politics and war, I will. There was a curiosity in that in the politics section in the world of administrative boundaries, because the soak of Peterborough had county level authoritative responsibilities, and that was you could argue that was the smallest county in Britain for the first half of the 20th century, so a little curiosity there. So that's why I'm going to go up to 3. So our second category is science and industry, and we said Peterborough is pretty old. The cathedral dates back 900 years, and you mentioned the Vikings, but what were people doing for a living back then?
I suppose if we go back to early industry, early commerce in Peterborough, a lot of its commercial history has been bound up to its role as an agricultural market centre for the rural areas around it. In the Middle Ages, Peterborough's main trade was in wool, but by late Stuart times, Peterborough was specialising in producing poultry for London. Bit of a change there. By the 1880s, a gazetteer entry shows just how much the city's markets had diversified. It says that Peterborough had markets for corn and fat stock and fairs for cattle, horses, sheep, etc. It had trade in malt, coal and timber. So this agricultural market centre role continued for a very long time. However, by that point, I think railways had been established as the principal source and cause of industry in Peterborough, and probably the reason Peterborough grew into the city it is today. There's an interesting story attached to this, though, because the main line that goes through Peterborough, the East Coast Main Line as it is today, might never have gone through the city. The Great Northern Railway Line, which today forms the southern part of the East Coast Main Line, would have gone further west through Stamford, but had to be diverted in 1846 because influential locals in Stamford didn't want the railway line there, and the Earl of Exeter refused to allow the line to cross his land at Burley House. And if you look on a map at the route of the East Coast Main Line today, you can see a clear deviation between Stevenage further south than Stamford, where it goes via Peterborough, with Stamford clearly offering a much more direct option. And the consequences of this were pretty striking for both cities in different ways. Stamford, which had previously prospered, remained a small market town, and Peterborough, which benefited from the diversion of the railway line, just grew and grew from that point.
It is interesting. You some parts of Peterborough city centre do resemble Stamford, and you can sort of, if you didn't know you were in Peterborough, you could think you're in the quiet, rather idyllic market town of Stamford, which never had this later industry and expansion.
Yeah, and there's no question. I mean, it's not a Stamford episode, so I won't talk too much about it, but Stamford does have more of that, old feel about it. When you go there, it certainly could be characterised as a much older city than Peterborough could. So I think talking about the Great Northern Railway specifically, which this first linked London to Yorkshire from 1850, that was the most important railway link that transformed Peterborough. But there were several other lines that already ran through the town, which did form one other good reason to pick it as a location for the line. Even today, it's an important railway interchange for people, particularly in East Anglia, travelling to the Midlands or North. And we'll remember changing there multiple times per year when we were travelling home from university in Nottingham, always that change in Peterborough to get home or get back there. The railway helped Peterborough grow, partly because of the new commercial opportunities offered, but also because Peterborough became a centre for the railways themselves. In 1901, 25% of Peterborough's adult male population was employed in the railway industry, really a very high amount indeed. This also means, though, that there was lots of warehousing, lots of distribution in Peterborough. So the city was not so much producing, but once again facilitating trade as it had done historically. The Great Northern Railway later started investing in Peterborough's infrastructure. It built 200 workers' cottages in the 1870s, along with accompanying facilities like St Paul's Church, which remained remains today, and a school for workers' children. And Henry Royce of Rolls-Royce started his engineering career as an apprentice with the GNR. This has all left us with some Victorian terraced railway housing around Lincoln Road running away from the station. They're pretty good quality for that type of housing. And another remnant of Peterborough's railway heritage is its preserved Nene Valley Railway, the heritage line running from Peterborough to Yarwell, 7.5 miles away, another popular attraction today.
And all of this cemented Peterborough's reputation for having great communications with the rest of the country. And that was reinforced by the presence of the A1, which is the major north-south road as well historically, and now upgraded to the A1M. And that goes on today, and that's part of Peterborough's appeal today. So beyond the railways, what other major industries grew up around Peterborough?
It has been an important centre for a few others. It was the UK's largest producer of bricks for most of the 20th century, with the London Brick Company founded there in 1900. An interesting remnant is that the brickworks have left large holes in the surrounding areas, known as knot holes. Francis Pryor says that one near Fletton on the outskirts of Peterborough is the largest man-made hole in Europe. I haven't double-checked that myself. It may or may not be true, but it's a good source, and I'm prepared to believe it. And
yeah, he's generally good, Francis Pryor.
Yeah, he's a very, very good source for the podcast. So some of these holes, they weren't just left though; they were filled in with ash from power stations. The area that Hampton, the south of Peterborough, was built on is one of those. Some were filled in with water. This is presumably in addition to the scars of earlier medieval stone mines in the area. In 1689, Celia Fiennes gave us some impression of these, describing the journey to Peterborough as the way is deep and full of sloughs. So clearly there's always been a bit of a habit of digging holes and leaving them in the Peterborough area.
And I'll say a bit more about these bricks because they've had a profound influence on building in England. And the background to these bricks is the subsoil, which emerges just south of Peterborough, Oxford clay, particularly high in organic compounds, which means it requires lower temperature to burn and much less energy to burn in the kilns to make the bricks, which is why so many of them were made in Peterborough and just south of Bedford as well. It also led to significant immigration of Italians. So it's got one of the highest Italian populations in the country. And this is because there was a labour shortage in the 1950s. So thousands of Italians were recruited from southern Italy. And these bricks really are all over the country. So I said in the intro that, there's a good chance you might live in a Fletton brick property if you live in England. And according to their website, the successor to the London Brick Company, 5 million homes in the UK are built with Fletton bricks, which must be around 20% of the housing stock, which is extraordinary, really. You need about 8,000 bricks to build a home. So by my maths, that's 40 billion Fletton bricks in Britain alone. A guy that was associated with the Fletton brickworks was John Cathles Hill, who I've been reading about on the Scottish brick history because he was from Dundee, and he founded the London Brick Company. And as well as industrialising the complex at Fletton, he built huge numbers of homes around Peterborough and around London. And when I left university, I lived in an area of London called the Haringey Ladders. And as I understand it, John Cathles Hill built, or at least developed, that area of brick terraced housing in North London with his development company that came from the brickworks. He built the Napoleon Kiln, which was the largest kiln in the world when it was built in the 1930s. He was actually producing 2 million bricks a week. And for a long time, there would have been a skyline of those tall kiln chimneys south of Peterborough. I believe they've all been demolished, but a few remain at a different site by Whittlesea. And you see them as you're coming in on the train that you mentioned from the east, these very tall kiln towers. I think they're being gradually demolished. But to the south of Peterborough now, the site is becoming the site of the Hamptons, which is a vast suburban housing development, a fourth township. And we'll come back to the townships when we talk about the expanded town.
What was that number you said for number of bricks?
Well, oh gosh, my maths is you need 8,000 bricks to build a home and 5 million homes built from Fletton bricks. So I'm getting to 40 billion.
No wonder the holes are so big then. Yeah, I'm definitely believing Francis Pryor on that then. No question.
Yes, a huge excavation. To be fair, that number might include the Bedford brickworks as well, but still huge holes in the ground around Peterborough and Bedford. What other industries have we had in Peterborough?
Yeah, so one more industry to focus on is probably sugar. It's the headquarters of British Sugar. The first Peterborough sugar factory opened in 1926, turning sugar beet into sugar. This was the start of a new industry using homegrown beet instead of imported cane in several factories, including many along the east of England. I don't know if you remember that horrible smell we used to get in the mornings. Everyone used to say, oh, it's the sugar beet factory. I never knew if they were lying or not. I thought, well, sugar's supposed to smell nice, isn't it? It should smell like treacle.
No, those factories stink.
They do.
Big one on the edge of Ipswich.
Yeah, I think that
wrong
closed
side of town. The wind used to blow over.
That's
make
right.
The whole place stink.
On an autumn morning. It's basically the smell of the autumn mornings. Well, that closed a few years ago, so I haven't smelt that for a while. And so did the Peterborough one. The Peterborough one closed in 1991. But the central office of British Sugar, which makes about 2/3 of sugar in the UK, is in Peterborough and employs about 300 people. That's industry. We probably should just finish talking about a couple of important industrial or commercial figures from Peterborough. Henry Royce, we mentioned earlier. This is the Henry Royce of Rolls-Royce fame, his full name being Frederick Henry Royce. He was born on the outskirts of today's Peterborough in Alwalton, but more importantly for his career, Peterborough's industry was crucial in his early engineering learning as he took up an apprenticeship with the Great Northern Railway in Peterborough when a teenager. So this is his first proper scientific or engineering role. Another person I'll mention, maybe less familiar to some people, is Peter Boyzot. It's spelled Boizot, but I'm assured this pronunciation is Boyzot. He was the founder of Pizza Express. He was born and educated in Peterborough. He sang in the cathedral choir, and he stood for Parliament there twice for the Liberal Party. He founded Pizza Express, I was surprised by this year, in 1965. I'd assumed this was a much more recent chain, but no, it's been going for well over half a century now.
That's quite old.
Now, in the Oldie Guide, we don't normally mention people simply because they're from a town, but I think it's warranted here, not just because of Boyzot's upbringing, but because multiple sources give him the epithet Mr. Peterborough due to his investment in the city, such as hotels, in the cinema and in the football club, Peterborough United. So, yeah, an important figure to the people in Peterborough.
I tell you one industry that you haven't mentioned that comes up quite a lot in relation to Peterborough was the diesel engine works, Perkins Engines, founded in 1932. And they were renowned for developing high-efficiency diesel engines in the 30s at a time when most people considered diesel to be a fairly useless fuel for engines, and they just made it efficient. And then to this day, wow, we have diesel engines everywhere. So they did a good job. And I think their factory was where the Queensgate shopping centre is now. So, but the company still exists, but obviously not in such a city centre location. So between all this, there's been quite a lot of industry, but this is the science and industry section. So I wondered, is there much scientific achievement coming out of Peterborough?
There are two very important women in the field of science with close connections to Peterborough. Professor Daphne Jackson is the first. She's definitely a Peterboroughian that the city can be proud of. She was a nuclear physicist, became the first female physics professor in the UK in 1971. She was born in Peterborough in 1936 and educated in the city at the Peterborough County Grammar School for Girls. She held numerous professional accolades. She was Dean of the University of Surrey. She had a senior position at the Met Office. She was the youngest ever Fellow of the Institute of Physics and later became its Vice President. She helped promote women's employment rights, particularly for women to re-enter their careers after breaks from employment. A famous quote attributed to her is, "Imagine a society that would allow Marie Curie to stack shelves in a supermarket simply because she took a career break for family reasons."
Can't argue with that.
The second figure we'll talk about is Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was an important figure in the early history of vaccination and really should be better known. Her connection to Peterborough admittedly is a little slight. She married Edward Wortley Montagu, Peterborough's MP, and a benefactor who paid for various building projects in the town. Edward Wortley was an ambassador to Constantinople, where Mary came across techniques for inoculating against smallpox, and from there introduced them to England. She personally had the disease and her brother had died from it. So you can imagine there would have been some personal motivation there. The technique used was an early form of vaccination using live smallpox virus from an infected blister before Edward Jenner developed his cowpox vaccination. So yeah, two very important women in their own ways, but with big contributions to the field of science.
Absolutely. But we'll come on to summing up science and industry now, Daniel. I think you've got two important scientists there and, great figures, but there isn't much big famous scientific achievement in Peterborough. There isn't a university, for example. I think there's been campuses of other universities, so it hasn't had quite the output that we often talk about in this section. But quite a lot of industry there, quite a lot of interesting industrial history. What are your thoughts?
So thoughts on science and industry for Peterborough. We've definitely found a few things to talk about. I suppose my question is, what can you still see in Peterborough? What sense do you get of industrial or scientific prowess? Peterborough's railway history, for instance, it's certainly important. There isn't the huge commemoration of this in the city, I don't think, at least not an overt one. You can compare this with other railway towns like Crewe or Swindon. If you visit Swindon, you can't miss its railway heritage with the Great Western Railway Museum and the huge old railway works that have been repurposed as a shopping outlet, even the names of pubs and streets around the town. And to complete the comparison with Stamford from the point of historical interest, while Peterborough gained economically, you could perhaps argue it lost architecturally, with very little of pre-industrial Peterborough remaining, aside from the very, very notable exception, of course, the cathedral, whereas more of old Stamford remains. And I think perhaps the same with the scientific heritage. There are these two notable scientific figures from Peterborough. But as you've said, there's nothing broader in the sense of a research base in a university. And there isn't all that much commemoration in Peterborough either. Mary Wortley Montagu, to my knowledge, just has a picture on the wall of the Wetherspoons, but this probably is because her connection to the city was quite slight. But yeah, for me, it's going to be a solid score. It's not going to be a huge one. It's going to be a 4.5.
You're right on it, not celebrating the history. So you've got the Nene Valley Railway, but I agree, it hasn't got the Crewe's got the Railway Museum, Swindon's got steam, hasn't it? And that whole quarter of old railway buildings hasn't got that. And actually, in some ways, the railway station is a bit of a disappointment. Like you mentioned, transferring trains at Peterborough. Pretty miserable place to transfer, to be honest. Don't want to complain about it, but it's not the best. I thought the brickworks history was really interesting, but yeah, nothing left of it. And I know it's really difficult to preserve industrial heritage. It's really expensive. I know that at Marston Vale, they had to demolish the kiln chimneys because they were structurally unsound, and you've got the cost of preserving them. But it is a bit of a shame you haven't got more of that remaining. And there isn't really anything left of the other heavy industry. So for me, it's just going to be a 4 this time.
Okay, so that's 8.5 out of 20 for Peterborough on science and industry.
The third category is arts and culture. Now, I have to be honest, not many big artistic legacies jumped out for me here, but you have found something really significant.
The Peterborough Chronicle is one of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. I imagine these will be familiar to most listeners, even if just in name, but these are great national records of events in English history, written in Old English and begun by the Saxon Kingdom of Wessex under Alfred the Great in the late 9th century. You might recall we covered these in our Chester episode and noted, interestingly, how this has led to some bias towards events that concerned Wessex rather than the other Saxon kingdoms. Despite being started in the 800s, the chronicles used sources from as far back as the 600s and are hugely important because they are literally the only record we have for many of the events they chronicle, not least because their original source material is all lost. The chronicles were written in monasteries, with written copies sent to other monasteries, where the monks would maintain and update their own versions, including Peterborough's version, the Peterborough Chronicle. Now, of course, historical standards then weren't the same as today, and there is bias, omission, exaggeration, etc. in all of the different chronicles. But the fact they had this common origin of an original chronicle means you can also compare them against each other. So they function as a good record, not just of early English history, but as some historians have noted, of church and local politics as well, if that's what you're looking at. As we said, all monasteries they'd compose their own chronicle history, but Most stopped compiling these after the Norman conquest, when Anglo-Norman became the official language. Only 9 chronicles survive today, including the Peterborough Chronicle, written in Peterborough Abbey, today's Peterborough Cathedral, which was the most recently began of the surviving chronicles and one of the longest pieces of writing in English in that immediate period following the Norman conquest. The current document owes its existence to the 1116 fire we mentioned in the overview, which destroyed the old abbey along with its documents. This prompted the monks to restart their chronicle, copying those held in other churches as the starting basis. However, any records after 1116 are unique to the Peterborough Chronicle because it was subsequently continued for longer, up to 1154, than any other version of the Chronicle. And one historian notes it's the only prose history written in English between the Norman conquest and the late 1300s. So the Peterborough Chronicle as a historical document is really valuable in its own right. Moreover, it's not just an important document historically, it's also an important document linguistically. The Chronicle's language sits somewhere between Old English, which really today we wouldn't recognise at all, and Middle English, which we might to some extent. If you've ever tried to read, say, Geoffrey Chaucer, you might think how you've been able to make out most words and some general meaning, even if not all of it. And this means the Peterborough Chronicle stands as an important record of the development of English around that time. As examples, it has certain traits of Middle and Modern English that you wouldn't have found in Old English, like lots of French words, a lack of case endings, no grammatical gender, particularly in the parts that were written later. The Chronicle today isn't in Peterborough, unfortunately. It's currently held in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, but you can read some of the pages on their website, so it's open to all to access.
This sounds really significant to me, Daniel. I don't know much about this. This is very much your area, isn't it? You've been a linguist. You're interested in this period of history. How important is this document? It sounds very important from what you're saying.
Well, I think it is extremely important because it has that unique record after 1116. So the history in that is unique. It's important allied with all the other Anglo-Saxon chronicles because they are the only records we have, as I mentioned, for much of the history that we think we know. You always have to take a judicious approach to what you're believing, but without the chronicles, there is so much of pre-Norman history we would have absolutely no idea of. And the linguistic point is interesting as well, because, these are all points I recognise from continental languages or from Latin that have just phased out of existence or phased into existence in English, like grammatical gender completely being dropped, case endings being dropped, even if the remnants are there and kind of hidden sometimes. So, I think it's important.
Do you think this particular document and the importance of it is well associated with Peterborough today? I mean, it's called the Peterborough Chronicle, but is it celebrated in the city?
I don't think it is. I'm not aware of much celebration. I think it's mainly the name that gives the association. But I don't think that should take away too much from it, because the important point is it was written in the most important ecclesiastical institution, the most important institution in Peterborough. It was written in the cathedral by the monks there. Without cathedral, without Peterborough, it simply wouldn't exist. The events of Peterborough, the fire, helped to shape it. So, it's not there. I don't think it's well focused on. You're probably right. But, I'm going to give Peterborough some credit for this because Peterborough is essential to its existence.
Absolutely fascinating. Now, I'm going to move us on a completely different. We're going to move forward to cover music now. I hadn't heard of any musicians from Peterborough particularly, but you found someone brilliant.
Someone brilliant. Yeah, I do like this. Andy Bell of Erasure. He was one half of Erasure, one of the most important synth pop acts in music, one of Britain's most successful pop groups with 5 number 1 albums, 40 top 40 hit singles. And he was born and grew up in Peterborough. He was a bit of a social pioneer. He was one of music's first openly gay singers. He has a great, really distinctive voice. If you think you don't know anything about Erasure, if we're old men and it's fallen out of pop culture somehow with young people listening, Google Erasure, search for it on Spotify. You'll definitely know some of their songs. You'll know the distinctive voice. It's great music.
Oh, absolutely. You will have heard of them. And if it wasn't for these pesky copyright laws, we could have a little clip now and a little dance in the studio. But anyway, you'll
Do you
have
have
to.
your guitar next to you?
Yeah,
Could you play some?
I don't think you're allowed to do that. I don't
Really?
think you can do that. No, I think
No.
podcasts is very, very difficult unless you're the BBC, of course. Then you can do anything.
Yeah.
Anything. Fantastic. Well, we're going to finish now in this section with somewhere we visited. We took a bit of a walk. Do you remember? To the outskirts of Peterborough, to the Longthorpe Tower, and I thought we were going there just to look at an old building, but that's not why we went there. We went there for some art.
Mm-hmm. Yep, Longthorpe Tower. Longthorpe Tower is a 14th century tower on the outskirts of Peterborough, originally built as part of a manor house. We've put it in the art and culture section today rather than urban landscape, because it's possibly the most famous for its wonderful medieval murals from around 1330. Some historians have described them as the finest domestic medieval wall paintings in Europe. One reason they're so good is that unlike many similar surviving examples, you can actually make out what the pictures in the mural are supposed to be. There are pictures on the internet. Google them now, have a look at them. The paintings were actually covered and forgotten about for many years, but rediscovered by the Home Guard, by Dad's Army in World War II, when a member accidentally whacked the whitewashed wall with his rifle butt, which actually I could imagine as a scene from Dad's Army, quite frankly. But it turned out well this time. He found the paintings behind. I can't find much contemporary action in the local press, so I don't know how much of a stir this caused locally, but it has become a nice attraction for English heritage today. The tower's got small exhibits and occasional events, as well as those famous murals.
Wow. So it turns out there was a bit to talk about in arts and culture in Peterborough. So look, I apologise to Peterborough for writing off Peterborough in the arts and culture section. But I have to say, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Peterborough Chronicle, clearly massive. But other than that, there isn't much you can associate culturally with Peterborough. So it's hard for me to find a big score for it. I'm totally convinced, though, by what you've said about the Peterborough Chronicle. So it will get some points from me. It's going to get a 4.
4. Okay. So, yeah, definitely some points to the Peterborough Chronicle, some consideration for Longthorpe Tower. But really, there's not much of significance outside the Chronicle that we've been able to talk about. Given that Peterborough really expanded following industrialisation, you'd think maybe its greatest cultural contributions would have been in the last couple of hundred years, perhaps, after its massive expansion. But it's been a real struggle to find any notable cultural figures who owe any inspiration to Peterborough. We've talked about Andy Bell. He's basically the only person I could find. And while from the city, he doesn't speak all that kindly of it. He said of Peterborough, unfortunately, there was nothing for young people to do except get drunk and fight. He described Peterborough and Detroit as the most scary places on the planet. He almost represents a case study in his own right for Peterborough. I've been unable to find much, really any mention of him in Peterborough local press before he was nationally famous. The only local concert I can find was a 1988 charity gig in aid of Thorpe Hall, which is now a hospice, but previously the maternity hospital where he was born. So it doesn't sound like there's much evidence for Andy Bell's time in Peterborough being all that formative. More broadly, it's a shame that Peterborough's industrial expansion didn't seem to inspire much creativity. Even if we can't expect anything comparable with Liverpool, for instance, even Swindon's industrial and railway connections did inspire musicians. Even Reading is another good comparison. There are many cultural figures we found from Reading. Anyone from Peterborough might think that John Clare, the 19th century romantic poet, should fit into this category and might be screaming his name now. But while his papers are held in Peterborough Museum, he isn't really from Peterborough. His birthplace, Helpston, was near Stamford, which was historically the significant place in his own right. So I'm not talking about him today. So yeah, certainly points to the Peterborough Chronicle, very important document. But for me, the points have to be pretty low here. So it's probably going to be a 1.5.
1.5.
And
Well, it's interesting.
Chronicle.
It's interesting what you said about Andy Bell, because the contrast I was thinking was Paul Heaton and Hull, where there were all those examples of where Paul Heaton played. We went to the pub where he played. There's much more influence from the city. Yeah, Peterborough could do with a big musical scene, perhaps some synth pop. There we go.
University in the long run.
Brilliant stuff. The fourth category is urban landscape. Now, I mentioned at the start, Peterborough is interesting because it's got this very historic core with buildings spanning the last millennium, but it's really small. But then it's got this sprawling suburban region, and we need to piece this together. Let's start, though, with the old stuff. Let's start from the beginning.
Yeah, let's go right back to the start. I think it's fair to say Peterborough's historically been a bit of a piecemeal settlement in the way it's grown. And this has really characterised how the city has grown and changed from the beginning. There were Bronze Age, Iron Age and Roman settlements dotted around the area. No direct continuation between these and the current town. And this has meant that some of the interesting ancient sites are outside the city centre. But this has left us with interesting places to visit near Peterborough. Flag Fen is a Bronze Age site, a wooden causeway across the fens on about 1,000 oak posts and associated homes, possibly of religious significance. And also we have Roman Dorobrovi to the west near Water Newton. Beyond the man-made world, one of the last Mesolithic-looking landscapes in the country is very close to Peterborough. Home Fen Nature Reserve, 5 minutes south of Peterborough Station on the railway line. This area is typical of post-Ice Age woods that used to cover the country. It constitutes birch woodland growing in peat with thinner tree cover, which used to make hunting easier. It's also some of the lowest land in Britain, only 2 metres above sea level, which is a point we will certainly come back to later when talking about the fens more broadly. Back to Peterborough's archaeological evidence today. There was a Roman settlement where the abbey is today, where the cathedral, I should call it, where the cathedral is today, while there was a Roman fort on the outskirts of present-day Peterborough where Thorpewood Golf Course is. This was the only Roman fort in Western Europe known to have an on-site pottery. It was from here that the 9th Legion was sent on its doomed mission to quell Boudicca's rebellion, with 80% of them killed at Colchester. There was another Roman settlement at Ferry Meadows, plus numerous metalworking and pottery workshops excavated at Normangate Field. Peterborough made the most of its Roman links with a series of pro-business adverts in the 1980s with Roy Kinnear, who you might recognise from Carry On films, dressed as a Roman, encouraging businesses in Latin to move to the city. I only wanted to drop that in the hope that someone else who likes Carry On films will search for that on YouTube and be astonished by it.
It is astonishing.
Middle Ages, moving on to that, medieval Peterborough also sat on a small area on the north side of the River Nene. The city centre remains there today, but there's been a lot of residential expansion on the south bank in recent centuries, along with industrial works, including the brickworks around Fletton. An interesting point about the medieval town is that, as with many other places, the street level was lower then, and you can see evidence of this today in St John's Church in the city centre, which was built in 1407 and is notably lower than the surrounding streets. It requires you to step down to get to it because it sits at the original 15th century street level. We also know that medieval Peterborough was notorious for its stinking streets. Animal and butcher's waste had left the streets reeking since the Middle Ages. Historians have stated that this was all sorted out by the local government in 1874 when certain commercial activities producing waste like that were restricted to specific streets, but that the remnants remained. When the cathedral square was dug up for examining in recent years, the stench of all the organic matter was actually still all there underneath it. I don't want to know what that smelled like after hundreds.
No, I hate to think. I thought everywhere smelled Middle Ages.
Yeah,
Peterborough more than others.
I think if you've got butchers throwing their waste into the street, you're going to get an extra bit of smell there.
I'm not surprised. Right, what about modern Peterborough then? Let's get to the modern period.
Modern bit, the bit you're interested in.
No, I mean, I'm interested in all periods. Going to move away from the stinky Peterborough and
especially interested in. Sorry, I did you a disservice. As with many other cities, Peterborough grew rapidly in the 19th century with new industry, new employment opportunities helping its population to double between 1801 and 1861. And this, as you'd expect, had considerable impact on Peterborough. The modern housing growth south of the Nene grew up alongside modern industry. As some historians have noted, this meant that commuting was two-way for a long time, people crossing from the southern residential areas to the city centre and from the city centre in northern areas to the industry down in the south. However, unlike many other comparable industrial towns, Peterborough saw its main era of population growth after the Second World War, when it became one of a number of designated new towns in 1967. It was part of the second generation of new towns, places that took London post-war overspill population, but were significant commercial centres in their own right too. Many already had significant populations. For example, Peterborough's was about 80,000, and it didn't take long for Peterborough's population to shoot up. Peterborough's new town construction was quite sprawling. It brought together suburbs with their own commercial centres quite some way from the centre. There were a few quite interesting points about it. The small street Svenskaby with Swedish-style housing, plus the fact that the envisioned expansion to the wings of the city never happened, leaving some quite rural areas within the city in addition to the built-up suburbia north and west. This expansion impacted the city centre too, with the construction of Queensgate as part of the new town centre in 1976 as a big new shopping centre. This was opened in 1982 by another royal connection here, the Queen of the Netherlands. The unfortunate thing here is it did block the view of the cathedral as you arrived at the station, so probably didn't improve your first impressions of the city.
No, it does sort of block the way between the station and the city centre as well if you're coming to the city that way. I mean, I think it's, at some point, I think we'll do a special episode on new towns, because Peterborough's it was in the new towns legislation. It was cited as a new town, but it's more of an expanded town. And I think it was one of the last ones, because you described it as the second generation of new towns. And I think what you're referring to there is that the first generation was the pre-war garden cities, Welland and Letchworth. But then the post-war new towns, I think Peterborough was the third wave, and it was in the same wave as Warrington, which we spoke about a few episodes ago. It has a similar structure to Warrington. And that first wave also gave us Milton Keynes. If you look at the suburbia of Peterborough, the three large lobes of suburbia, they're known as townships: Warrington, Bretton, Orton. These do have a lot of the characteristics of Milton Keynes: large blocks with dual carriageways and roundabouts, and housing clustered in cul-de-sacs. Quite car dependent, although Orton does have a busway of sorts, a dedicated bus route, but they are really sprawling and do cars, and in a way they feel quite separate from the city centre. The fourth township, Hamptons, which is being built to the south now, is equally sprawling. So in some ways these areas are quite efficient. You can drive around them quickly, but they don't really connect very well for me with the historic core, with the exception perhaps of the Queensgate Centre, which is right in the historic core. In fact, it's joined right in it. And you might remember when we visited Peterborough last time, we walked through the shopping centre, I think from the station, and we found ourselves in the Westgate Arcade, which is Edwardian arcade, which is somehow subsumed into the 1980s shopping centre. So quite extraordinary in some ways, and not all bad. Should we talk about the most notable buildings in Peterborough then? Talk about the cathedral then, which really is extraordinary.
Yeah, let's do that. From new town to ancient city, the cathedral is by far the most notable and famous building in Peterborough. The first abbey on this site was founded by the first abbot, we'll say his name one more time, Sexwulf, on land granted by Peder, king of the Saxon kingdom of southern Mercia. His brother Wulfhere finished the job in atonement for murdering his sons. The town of Peterborough, then called Meadhampstead, grew up around the abbey. Early Peterborough was completely dependent on the church. Their demands provided work which brought people to and retained them in the small village. Construction of the current building started in 1118, 2 years after the fire that destroyed most of the building. An apse at the east end, an apse is a big circular recess into the end wall, was the first part built and is still there now. The town of Peterborough was also shifted at this point from east to the west of the cathedral, where the centre still is today. Limestone for the cathedral came from nearby Barnack and was taken the 10 miles to Peterborough by river. The quarry there has been turned into the Hills and Holes Nature Reserve that you can see. And you can see, even just looking on Google Maps, just how torn up the land is there. The abbey took 120 years to build. It later became a cathedral under Henry VIII after the Reformation. It escaped the destruction that so many other abbeys suffered. It was one of 5 new cathedrals added at this point, the first post-Norman Anglican cathedrals in England, and the last new ones until the 19th century, when population expansion warranted more. While the view is unfortunately blocked from some angles today, including, as we mentioned, from the station. The cathedral's impact on this otherwise really flat, low-lying landscape at the Fens was probably much more impressive in the past. Daniel Defoe in the 1720s says it could be seen throughout the Fens. He also called it truly fine and beautiful and said if only it had a spire, it would be the third finest cathedral in Britain. He had in mind St Paul's Cathedral and York Minster. It stands in pretty much the same condition today as when it was built, and it's notable as, with Durham, one of the few Norman cathedrals that survives pretty much as it looked when constructed. Most cathedrals remaining from that point have either been rebuilt or heavily restored since then. The west front, with its three gables and archways, is its main feature, while the eastern end features lots of graffiti. There's a bloke called John Foster who scratched his name there at least 4 times between 1687 and 1688. He must have had a lot of time in his hands there. Also famous is the nave's original wooden ceiling, which is almost unique, as only 4 wooden painted ceilings in Europe survive from the 12th and 13th century. And finally, the cathedral contains the header stone, which is a Saxon sculpted stone from about 1,250 years ago, depicting 12 figures, possibly monks, possibly apostles. Might have been part of a shrine on the site, but yeah, it's one of its main possessions.
So it really is an extraordinary building, and I think the most underrated cathedral in the country, and the earliest examples of the English Gothic. And also, as well, it's free entry, so you can just go on in there, go out. It's much less busy. You think of the cathedral cities; they're always full of tourists teeming around. It's busy, and you have to pay to get in. Canterbury, York, but no, Peterborough's extraordinary and much more relaxed to visit. So I would recommend it. And it sits at the heart of Peterborough, which has got this really fantastic historic core. It's not big at all. It's a few streets. And there's a few other notable buildings that's worth mentioning.
There are, although I'd say for an ancient cathedral city, it's notable how few really old buildings, apart from the cathedral, Peterborough has. You can actually kind of list the few that survive. They include the former Cumbergate Workhouse. It was built in the 17th century. Some sources say the 15th. The Historic England Register says the 17th. It converted in the early 18th century to be a workhouse. You've also got the Bull on Westgate, Peterborough's oldest hotel, where the Beatles stayed one night for a concert in Peterborough. This was built in the late 18th century and originally a coaching inn with the courtyard just through the main entrance, but this has since been built over. Finally, the Guildhall. This was built in 1671 to commemorate Charles II's restoration. It was originally a market building, but then served as the town hall from 1874 to 1933. So those are the old buildings. I will talk about just one more modern area that I quite like. At Peterborough Lido, the open-air swimming pool in the city and the surrounding area known as the Embankment have quite an interesting story. The Lido was built in an area just by the River Nene, which used to flood a lot. This problem was solved by dumping a load of waste in that area, raising the land and creating a very long stretch of parkland along the north bank of the Nene. You might remember we visited that area, and I really don't think you'd guess when walking through it that so much of it has been created artificially. I think it's a pretty good job.
Yeah, I also thought the Lido was pretty cool as a building. But I want to say a little bit more about the urban landscape of the very centre of Peterborough, because this is bits of Peterborough that I really like, and that's around Cathedral Square, because it's been laid out as completely open space, fully pedestrianised, and the choice of materials used sit well with the cathedral, the Guildhall and St John's Church. And it's been quite well integrated into the surrounding streets. So there's about 4 streets which do reflect the cathedral in many ways and give you that impression of a historic city centre. It's just very small. I'm thinking Priestgate, Cowgate, the grounds of the cathedral. Do you remember we walked around the grounds of the cathedral before we went to the Lido? It does give a small but pleasant historic core, which contrasts completely with the dual carriageway which separates this core from the station. I think it's optimistically called a boulevard, but it's really just a horrible dual carriageway. But yeah, Bridge Street as well, going down towards the river. If you're going to the football, you go down that way, that's quite a pleasant route as well. And you're starting to see some development around the River Nene. There's a new Hilton Hotel, trying to give a bit more focus to that part of the city. Now, you mentioned Peterborough Cathedral and how it would have looked against the flat landscape. I suppose the cathedral I think of is Ely Cathedral, where you get that impression. You can see Ely Cathedral for miles around, right? And I suppose Peterborough would have been a bit like that, which brings us on really to the fens in general. Peterborough sits in this part of England known as the Fens, and well, tell us a bit about the Fens.
Yeah, I'd like to talk specifically about the the drainage of the Fens. It's an incredible engineering feat. You might question whether it belongs strictly in an episode about Peterborough, but I think it's just so interesting. I want to talk about it really. Plus, Peterborough does stand at the edge of the Fens. It's sometimes called the gateway to the Fens. Mm-hmm. It's the largest settlement in the Fens. So, I'm including it here.
You can have it. We'll let you talk about the Fens.
Thank you. Thanks for indulging me. The Fens are a large area of eastern England, about 400,000 hectares, which contain the lowest parts of the whole UK. As a consequence, used to be primarily watery marshes with some islands. Think of the Isle of Ely, because it used to actually be an island. But they aren't like this anymore because of an incredible project from mainly the 17th century to drain them into very flat, low-lying agricultural land. Francis Pryor, again, has described this as the greatest single act of landscape transformation in modern times, and the major civil engineering project in Britain before the large-scale construction of canals. So that really tells you what a massive project it was. There may have been some minor drainage projects before under the Romans, who also constructed a causeway linking Peterborough with Norfolk, along with Anglo-Saxon flood defences, and some efforts at drainage in the early 17th century that didn't go well. But the modern drainage project started under the orders of Charles I, the one we mentioned earlier, who had his head cut off and stayed in Peterborough on the way there, who wanted to develop taxable farmland from the rich peat below the western fenland waters around Peterborough. The drainage project started properly in the 1630s with the construction of the straight rivers like the Old Bedford River, named after the Earl of Bedford, who started the project, to drain water directly into the Great Ouse in Norfolk and out to the sea. Other artificial drainage rivers were constructed, including reservoirs for storing water and sluices to control tides, all dug by hand, and the projects continued even after the Civil War and under the interregnum. Scottish prisoners of war from the Civil War were used for some of the work. Construction used knowledge gained from draining similar areas of marshland in, as you might expect, the Netherlands, and one of the engineers responsible was a Dutchman who'd worked on projects like this. Now, we were all impressed by this, but at the time, not everyone was happy. There were protests by locals who depended on the Fens for their livelihood, for example, for fishing, who took direct action and destroyed some of the drainage infrastructure. They were known as the Fen Tigers, who you might be familiar with, even if you're not familiar with the history of the Fens, because they inspired the name of a local speedway team, Mildenhall Fen Tigers. Despite their opposition, the project continued throughout and beyond the 17th century, with channels and farmland replacing the previous marshes. The drainage system was finally more or less completed by the 1950s and still requires control today to prevent the low-lying land flooding.
It's extraordinary, really, and it's extraordinary to quite how old such a vast civil engineering scheme, how it was achieved in the 17th century, and absolutely remarkable, and a vast flat landscape.
Much cheap labour, I think, helps with these things in the 17th century.
And it's punctuated by the cathedrals at Ely and Peterborough. Well, let's conclude. Let's sum up on the urban landscape of Peterborough. I've sort of reflected that I quite like the very historic city centre core, but I'm struggling otherwise, as much as I find the history of the expanded and new towns interesting. I struggle to engage with them as places to visit. What are your thoughts?
I wonder if perhaps we too might approach this from different angles. So I'm going to caveat this with I'm talking fairly subjectively about what I'm looking for in a city's urban landscape. As others have noted, Peterborough is quite unique in being both a new town and a centuries-old cathedral city. So you would expect a good blend of old and new. However, if I can cite the Encyclopaedia Britannica here, it does say there are few buildings of interest in the city. And with the very, very obvious exception of the cathedral, which will get points in its own right. I think this is true. It's quite telling that we've been able to go through most of the notable pre-18th century buildings one by one. It's been a while since we've had so little material to go on in that respect. It seems that most of Peterborough's, even Georgian buildings, have either been demolished or, where they survive in any form, covered in new facades. To give some balance to this, Peterborough, despite its ancient history, is in most physical respects a modern town. It's a 19th century industrial and a 20th century new town, and wasn't a major settlement before these eras, with nearby Stamford being a better place to see Georgian buildings. But still, I can't deny there's very little that's notable or interesting from a historical perspective about Peterborough's landscape. There's only so much interest I think you can get out of sprawling suburbia.
Yep.
It isn't a particularly beautiful city to arrive in by train. We've mentioned the Queensgate shopping centre dominating your first impression of the city. Its modern development is not, I find it hard to get too excited by shopping centres, to be honest, as much as they've tried. So it's mostly a pretty ordinary place to walk around, in my view. So it certainly gets points for general interest, for this symbiosis of new town and ancient city being of some interest, and for the cathedral. It's not going to be huge scores, though. So I think I'm going to give it a 3.5.
Yeah, for me, I think when we visited, we both found the beginning of our trip quite bleak, particularly crossing from the railway station through to the city centre, and we couldn't find much. But around the cathedral itself was clearly pleasing, and the Lido. But it's a very small area for a city the size of Peterborough as well. I mean, it's well over 200,000. It's got a big economy, fast-growing place. There just isn't that much to see of interest. That said, I would say if you were waiting at Peterborough Station or you were driving up the A1 and you needed lunch, it's worth checking out. It's worth visiting Cathedral Square, the cathedral. It's definitely worth exploring. You should always explore, but there just isn't that much there for a city of its size. So for me, it's a 3. So, Daniel, we've kind of done a bit of the reality versus expectations because we've talked about our reactions to the city, walking around it and the scale of the city. Any more thoughts you've got on reality versus expectations?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief because you're right. We have touched on this as we've gone. As with we've seen with quite a lot of Peterborough's points, there's not a huge amount that is important that's happened in the town itself or the city has given to the world. We've seen how some major events in English history, wars and battles, industries, scientific discoveries, touched Peterborough a little or involved people with some connections to the city, but Peterborough was rarely at the centre of events, just kind of on the periphery of these things. You can compare it with other similar sized towns like Swindon, Wakefield, Reading, Warrington, where there have in some cases been significant events like battles, even coronations or industrial innovations. This is possibly because Peterborough, as we've said, is still a fairly new town in many ways. You can compare this with our last episode on Liverpool, notwithstanding, of course, the vastly different scales of the two places. Liverpool was a city that saw more of its cultural growth in modern times and managed to exceed in so many different ways. Yet it feels like in Peterborough, you don't have the benefit of the industrial growth and the new town growth later, nor is there so much that's interesting that's happened previously due to its role as an ancient cathedral city. There's stuff that's touched it. There's nothing that's core or central or key to British or world history. So for me, it perhaps came in a bit below what I was expecting. So it's going to be, I think, another 3.5 from me.
Yeah, for a city of its size, there isn't that much there. What I would say, though, is one of the great things about researching this podcast and doing this podcast is you always find something. There's always stuff that surprises you, whether that's the Peterborough Chronicle, the extent of the brickworks at Fletton, and some of the historic figures that were buried at the cathedral. I think it's got interest. There just isn't much for its size. So for me, it's just slightly under. I'm going to give it a 4.
4. Okay. So overall, that's 5.5 out of 20 for politics and war, 8.5 out of 20 for science and industry, 5.5 for art and culture, urban landscape 6.5, reality expectation 7.5. Overall, that's 33.5 for Peterborough.
that's all we have time for today. And if you haven't been to Peterborough, as I say, do check it out. There's always something to see, and the cathedral is free. And if you can't make it to Peterborough, just remember there's probably a little bit of Peterborough in the house you're living in, if you live in the UK anyway. You can listen to and comment on all our episodes at our website, yeoldieguide.com. We'd love to hear from you. All our episodes are available on Apple, Spotify, everywhere else. And we love it if you leave a rating or review for the podcast at these places too. We have upcoming episodes of Brighton, York, Norwich, and plenty more. But for now, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. Thanks for listening.